Chapter 9 of The Golden Bowl. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Leanne Howlett. The Golden Bowl by Henry James. Book 2, Chapter 9. So much mute communication was doubtless all this time marvelous, and we may confess to having perhaps read into the scene prematurely a critical character that took longer to develop. Yet the quiet hour of reunion enjoyed that afternoon by the father and the daughter did really little else than deal with the elements definitely presented to each in the vibration produced by the return of the churchgoers. Nothing elusive, nothing at all insistent, passed between them either before or immediately after luncheon, except indeed so far as their failure soon again to meet might be itself an accident charged with reference. The hour or two after luncheon, and on Sundays with especial rigour, for one of the domestic reasons of which it belonged to Maggie quite multitudinously to take account, were habitually spent by the Princess with her little boy, in whose apartment she either frequently found her father already established, or was sooner or later joined by him. His visit to his grandson, at some hour or other, held its place in his day, against all interventions, and this without counting his grandson's visits to him, scarcely less ordered and timed, and the odd bits, as he called them, that they picked up together when they could. Communions snatched, for the most part, on the terrace, in the gardens or the park, while the Principino, with much pomp and circumstance of perambulator, parasol, fine lace overveiling and incorruptible female attendants, took the air. In the private apartments which, occupying in the great house the larger part of a wing of their own, were not much more easily accessible than if the place had been a royal palace, and the small child an heir apparent, in the nursery of nurseries the talk, at these instituted times, was always so prevailingly with or about the master of the scene that other interests and other topics had fairly learned to avoid the slighting and inadequate notice there taken of them. They came in at the best, but as involved in the little boy's future, his past, or his comprehensive present, never getting so much as a chance to plead their own merits or to complain of being neglected. Nothing, perhaps, in truth, had done more than this united participation to confirm in the elder parties that sense of a life not only uninterrupted, but more deeply associated, more largely combined, of which, on Adam Verver's behalf, we have made some mention. It was of course an old story and a familiar idea that a beautiful baby could take its place as a new link between a wife and a husband, but Maggie and her father had, with every ingenuity, converted the precious creature into a link between a mamma and a grandpapa. The Principino, for a chance spectator of this process, might have become, by an untoward stroke, a hapless half-orphan, with the place of immediate male parent swept bare and open to the next nearest sympathy. They had no occasion thus, the conjoined worshippers, to talk of what the Prince might be or might do for his son. The sum of service, in his absence, so completely filled itself out. It was not in the least, moreover, that there was doubt of him, for he was conspicuously addicted to the manipulation of the child, in the frank Italian way, at such moments as he judged discreet in respect to other claims. Conspicuously, indeed, that is, for Maggie, who had more occasion, on the whole, to speak to her husband of the extravagance of her father than to speak to her father of the extravagance of her husband. Adam Verver had, all round, in this connection, his own serenity. He was sure of his son-in-law's auxiliary admiration he meant of his grandson, since, to begin with, what else had been at work but the instinct, or it might fairly have been the tradition, of the latter's making the child so solidly beautiful as to have to be admired? What contributed most to harmony in this play of relations, however, was the way the young man seemed to leave it to be gathered that, tradition for tradition, the grandpapa's own was not, in any estimate, to go for nothing. A tradition, or whatever it was, that had flowered prelusively in the Princess herself, well, Amerigo's very discretions were his way of taking account of it. His discriminations in respect to his heir were, in fine, not more angular than any others to be observed in him, and Mr. Verver received perhaps from no source so distinct an impression of being for him an odd and important phenomenon as he received from this impunity of appropriation, these unchallenged nursery hours. It was as if the grandpapa's special show of the character were but another side for the observer to study, another item for him to note. It came back, this latter personage knew, to his own previous perception, that of the Prince's inability, in any matter in which he was concerned, to conclude. The idiosyncrasy for him, at each stage, had to be demonstrated, on which, however, he admirably accepted it. This last was, after all, the point. He really worked, poor young man, for acceptance, since he worked so constantly for comprehension. And how, when you came to that, could you know that a horse wouldn't shy at a brass band, in a country road, because it didn't shy at a traction engine? It might have been brought up to traction engines without having been brought up to brass bands. Little by little, thus, from month to month, the Prince was learning what his wife's father had been brought up to, and now it could be checked off. He had been brought up to the romantic view of Principini. Who would have thought it, and where would it all stop? The only fear somewhat sharp for Mr. Verver was a certain fear of disappointing him for strangeness. He felt that the evidence he offered, thus viewed, was too much on the positive side. He didn't know, he was learning, and it was funny for him, to how many things he had been brought up. If the Prince could only strike something to which he hadn't! This wouldn't, it seemed to him, ruffle the smoothness, and yet might, a little, add to the interest. What was now clear, at all events, for the father and the daughter, was their simply knowing they wanted, for the time, to be together, at any cost, as it were, and their necessity so worked in them as to bear them out of the house, in a quarter hidden from that in which their friends were gathered, and cause them to wander unseen, unfollowed, along a covered walk in the old garden, as it was called, old with an antiquity of formal things, high box and shaped yew and expanses of brick wall that had turned at once to purple and to pink. They went out of a door in the wall, a door that had a slab with a date set above it, 1713, but in the old multiplied lettering, and then had before them a small white gate, intensely white and clean amid all the greenness, through which they gradually passed to where some of the grandest trees spaciously clustered and where they would find one of the quietest places. A bench had been placed, long ago, beneath a great oak that helped to crown a mild eminence, and the ground sank away below it, to rise again, opposite, at a distance sufficient to enclose the solitude and figure a bosky horizon. Summer, blissfully, was with them yet, and the low sun made a splash of light where it pierced the looser shade. Maggie, coming down to go out, had brought a parasol, which, as, over her charming bare head, she now handled it, gave, with the big straw hat that her father in these days always wore a good deal tipped back, definite intention to their walk. They knew the bench, it was sequestered, they had praised it for that together before and liked the word, and after they had begun to linger there they could have smiled, if they hadn't been really too serious, and if the question hadn't so soon ceased to matter, over the probable wonder of the others as to what would have become of them. The extent to which they enjoyed their indifference to any judgment of their want of ceremony, what did that of itself speak but for the way that, as a rule, they almost equally had others on their mind? They each knew that both were full of the superstition of not hurting, but might precisely have been asking themselves, asking in fact each other, at this moment, whether that was to be, after all, the last word of their conscientious development. Certain it was, at all events, that in addition to the Assinghams and the Lutches and Mrs. Rance, the attendants at tea, just in the right place on the west terrace might perfectly comprise the 4 or 5 persons, among them the very pretty, the typically Irish Miss Maddock, vaunted, announced and now brought, from the couple of other houses near enough, one of these the minor residence of their proprietor, established, thriftily, while he hired out his ancestral home, within sight and sense of his profit. It was not less certain, either, that, for once in a way, the group in question must all take the case as they found it. Fanny Assingham, at any time, for that matter, might perfectly be trusted to see Mr. Verver and his daughter, to see their reputation for a decent friendliness, through any momentary danger. might be trusted even to carry off their absence for Amerigo's possible funny Italian anxiety. Amerigo always being, as the Princess was well aware, conveniently amenable to this friend's explanations, beguilements, reassurances, and perhaps in fact rather more than less dependent on them as his new life, since that was his own name for it, opened out. It was no secret to Maggie, it was indeed positively a public joke for her, that she couldn't explain as Mrs. Assingham did, and that, the Prince liking explanations, liking them almost as if he collected them, in the manner of book plates or postage stamps, for themselves, his requisition of this luxury had to be met. He didn't seem to want them as yet for use, rather for ornament and amusement, innocent amusement of the kind he most fancied and that was so characteristic of his blessed, beautiful, general, slightly indolent lack of more dissipated or even just of more sophisticated tastes. However that might be, the dear woman had come to be frankly and gaily recognised, and not least by herself, as filling in the intimate little circle an office that was not always a sinecure. It was almost as if she had taken, with her kind, melancholy Colonel at her heels, a responsible engagement; to be within call, as it were, for all those appeals that sprang out of talk, that sprang not a little, doubtless, too, out of leisure. It naturally led her position in the household, as she called it, to considerable frequency of presence, to visits, from the good couple, freely repeated and prolonged, and not so much as under form of protest. She was there to keep him quiet. It was Amerigo's own description of her influence, and it would only have needed a more visible disposition to unrest in him to make the account perfectly fit. Fanny herself limited, indeed she minimised, her office. You didn't need a jailer, she contended, for a domesticated lamb tied up with pink ribbon. This was not an animal to be controlled. It was an animal to be, at the most, educated. She admitted accordingly that she was educative, which Maggie was so aware that she herself inevitably wasn't. So it came round to being true that what she was most in charge of was his mere intelligence. This left, goodness knew, plenty of different calls for Maggie to meet, in a case in which so much pink ribbon, as it might be symbolically named, was lavished on the creature. What it all amounted to, at any rate, was that Mrs. Assingham would be keeping him quiet now, while his wife and his father-in-law carried out their own little frugal picnic; quite, moreover, doubtless, not much less neededly in respect to the members of the circle that were with them there than in respect to the pair they were missing almost for the first time. It was present to Maggie that the Prince could bear, when he was with his wife, almost any queerness on the part of people, strange English types who bored him beyond convenience by being so little as he himself was; for this was one of the ways in which a wife was practically sustaining. But she was as positively aware that she hadn't yet learned to see him as meeting such exposure in her absence. How did he move and talk, how above all did he, or how would he, look, he who, with his so nobly handsome face, could look such wonderful things, in case of being left alone with some of the subjects of his wonder? There were subjects for wonder among these very neighbours, only Maggie herself had her own odd way, which didn't moreover the least irritate him, of really liking them in proportion as they could strike her as strange. It came out in her by heredity, he amused himself with declaring, this love of chinoiseries; but she actually this evening didn't mind; he might deal with her Chinese as he could. Maggie indeed would always have had for such moments, had they oftener occurred, the impression made on her by a word of Mrs. Assingham's, a word referring precisely to that appetite in Amerigo for the explanatory which we have just found in our path. It wasn't that the Princess could be indebted to another person, even to so clever a one as this friend, for seeing anything in her husband that she mightn't see unaided; but she had ever, hitherto, been of a nature to accept with modest gratitude any better description of a felt truth than her little limits, terribly marked, she knew, in the direction of saying the right things, enabled her to make. Thus it was, at any rate, that she was able to live more or less in the light of the fact expressed so lucidly by their common comforter, the fact that the Prince was saving up, for some very mysterious but very fine eventual purpose, all the wisdom, all the answers to his questions, all the impressions and generalisations he gathered, putting them away and packing them down because he wanted his great gun to be loaded to the brim on the day he should decide to let it off. He wanted first to make sure of the whole of the subject that was unrolling itself before him, after which the innumerable facts he had collected would find their use. He knew what he was about. Trust him at last therefore to make, and to some effect, his big noise. And Mrs. Assingham had repeated that he knew what he was about. It was the happy form of this assurance that had remained with Maggie. It could always come in for her that Amerigo knew what he was about. He might at moments seem vague, seem absent, seem even bored; this when, away from her father, with whom it was impossible for him to appear anything but respectfully occupied, he let his native gaiety go in outbreaks of song, or even of quite whimsical senseless sound, either expressive of intimate relaxation or else fantastically plaintive. He might at times reflect with the frankest lucidity on the circumstance that the case was for a good while yet absolutely settled in regard to what he still had left at home of his very own, in regard to the main seat of his affection, the house in Rome, the big black palace, the Palazzo Nero, as he was fond of naming it, and also on the question of the villa in the Sabine hills, which she had, at the time of their engagement, seen and yearned over, and the Castello proper, described by him always as the perched place, that had, as she knew, formerly stood up, on the pedestal of its mountain slope, showing beautifully blue from afar, as the head and front of the princedom. He might rejoice in certain moods over the so long estranged state of these properties, not indeed all irreclaimably alienated, but encumbered with unending leases and charges, with obstinate occupants, with impossibilities of use, all without counting the cloud of mortgages that had, from far back, buried them beneath the ashes of rage and remorse, a shroud as thick as the layer once resting on the towns at the foot of Vesuvius, and actually making of any present restorative effort a process much akin to slow excavation. Just so he might with another turn of his humour almost wail for these brightest spots of his lost paradise, declaring that he was an idiot not to be able to bring himself to face the sacrifices resting, if definitely anywhere, with Mr. Verver, necessary for winning them back. One of the most comfortable things between the husband and the wife, meanwhile, one of those easy certitudes they could be merely gay about, was that she never admired him so much, or so found him heartbreakingly handsome, clever, irresistible, in the very degree in which he had originally and fatally dawned upon her, as when she saw other women reduced to the same passive pulp that had then begun, once for all, to constitute her substance. There was really nothing they had talked of together with more intimate and familiar pleasantry than of the licence and privilege, the boundless happy margin, thus established for each, she going so far as to put it that, even should he some day get drunk and beat her, the spectacle of him with hated rivals would, after no matter what extremity, always, for the sovereign charm of it in itself and as the exhibition of him that most deeply moved her, suffice to bring her round. What would therefore be more open to him than to keep her in love with him? He agreed with all his heart, at these light moments, that his course wouldn't then be difficult, inasmuch as, so simply constituted as he was on all the precious question, and why should he be ashamed of it, he knew but one way with the fair. They had to be fair, and he was fastidious and particular, his standard was high. But when once this was the case, what relation with them was conceivable, what relation was decent, rudimentary, properly human, but that of a plain interest in the fairness? His interest, she always answered, happened not to be plain, and plainness, all round, had little to do with the matter, which was marked, on the contrary, by the richest variety of colour. But the working basis, at all events, had been settled, the Miss Maddocks of life been assured of their importance for him. How conveniently assured Maggie, to take him too into the joke, had more than once gone so far as to mention to her father, since it fell in easily with the tenderness of her disposition to remember she might occasionally make him happy by an intimate confidence. This was one of her rules, full as she was of little rules, considerations, provisions. There were things she of course couldn't tell him, in so many words, about Amerigo and herself, and about their happiness and their union and their deepest depths, and there were other things she needn't. But there were also those that were both true and amusing, both communicable and real, and of these, with her so conscious, so delicately cultivated scheme of conduct as a daughter, she could make her profit at will. A pleasant hush, for that matter, had fallen on most of the elements while she lingered apart with her companion. It involved, this serenity, innumerable complete assumptions, since so ordered and so splendid a rest, all the tokens, spreading about them, of confidence solidly supported, might have suggested for persons of poorer pitch the very insolence of facility. Still, they weren't insolent. They weren't, our pair could reflect. They were only blissful and grateful and personally modest, not ashamed of knowing, with competence, when great things were great, when good things were good, and when safe things were safe, and not, therefore, placed below their fortune by timidity, which would have been as bad as being below it by impudence. Worthy of it as they were, and as each appears, under our last possible analysis, to have wished to make the other feel that they were, what they most finally exhaled into the evening air as their eyes mildly met may well have been a kind of helplessness in their felicity. Their rightness, the justification of everything, something they so felt the pulse of, sat there with them, but they might have been asking themselves a little blankly to what further use they could put anything so perfect. They had created and nursed and established it. They had housed it here in dignity and crowned it with comfort. But mightn't the moment possibly count for them, or count at least for us while we watch them with their fate all before them, as the dawn of the discovery that it doesn't always meet all contingencies to be right? Otherwise, why should Maggie have found a word of definite doubt, the expression of the fine pang determined in her a few hours before, rise after a time to her lips? She took so for granted, moreover, her companion's intelligence of her doubt, that the mere vagueness of her question could say it all. "What is it, after all, that they want to do to you?" "They" were for the Princess, too, the hovering forces of which Mrs. Rance was the symbol, and her father, only smiling back now, at his ease, took no trouble to appear not to know what she meant. What she meant, when once she had spoken, could come out well enough, though indeed it was nothing, after they had come to the point, that could serve as ground for a great defensive campaign. The waters of talk spread a little, and Maggie presently contributed an idea in saying: "What has really happened is that the proportions for us are altered." He accepted equally for the time this somewhat cryptic remark. He still failed to challenge her even when she added that it wouldn't so much matter if he hadn't been so terribly young. He uttered a sound of protest only when she went to declare that she ought, as a daughter, in common decency, to have waited. Yet by that time she was already herself admitting that she should have had to wait long, if she waited, that is, till he was old. But there was a way. "Since you ARE an irresistible youth, we've got to face it. That, somehow, was what that woman has made me feel. There'll be others." End of Book 2, Chapter 9.